Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining and welcome to day 3 of our Risk Management Summit. I hope you've enjoyed lots of our sessions so far and gained lots of useful insights. So I'm Chris Boyle, Practice Director at Identity and Access Management at Turnkey Consulting, and I'll be your host for the session. It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome George Abetisov, CEO of Hyper, the global leaders in true passwordless authentication. So today, George will be talking about what I see personally as one of the biggest cyber risks to an organization, the central password store. Not only is this a hacker's favorite target, but combine this with users reusing their passwords for both their business and personal lives, and what you have is what I feel is one of the greatest risks to an organization, and why the future has to involve removal of this risk. So the main topics we'll be covering are around adoption of passwordless technology. Like all things cyber, it's not if, it's when. We'll also be talking about why credential reuse is a big, big problem. We'll talk a little bit about the history of passwords and how this has evolved. And finally, why the future has arrived and you've possibly not even noticed. Just for everyone's reference, we will have a question and answer session at the end. So if you can type your questions into the chat window, we'll try to answer as many of them as possible at the end. However, I don't want to steal any more of George's thunder. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to George. George, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. We're going to talk about passwords. We're going to talk about the passwordless decade, of what that means. Let's get right into it. Would love to introduce myself. My name is George. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hyper. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm joined today by an awesome team from Turnkey. And, we're going to dive right into it. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about credential reuse. It's a problem everybody's very familiar with, but why is it higher than ever before? We're also going to talk about authentication, its evolution, how it's changing, where it's going, and why we ultimately feel that this is the passwordless decade. And what we mean by that is when that clock hits January 1 on 2030, are we going to still have passwords? Well, it's a good question. If you look at the state of the world today, you'll see some interesting stats. The credential reuse industry is booming. It's never been better for the bad guys. ATO fraud is at an all-time high. 1 out of every 2 bank login attempts are malicious. I mean, more than half of consumer banking traffic is malicious. Just think about that. I think it's like 90% in retail, which is far worse. And when you look at credential stuffing attacks, you'll see, we're talking 30 billion plus in a year. These are ridiculously high stats. I mean, it's a problem that you think would get better as we've implemented all this multi-factor authentication over the past few years and invested so much into identity. But, an interesting way of thinking about it is Javelin's saying that, this migration from, applications to the cloud has really broadened this attack surface. It's not just for the consumer applications, but it's the workforce as well. We're seeing ATO fraud at a level like never before. And we're seeing the cost of the attacks going down for the adversary, while the cost of defense has increased for the enterprise. When you look at the cloud transformation, we've never had a larger attack surface. When you look at tools like Sniper, these are essentially tools that anybody at a high school level could use to launch a large-scale attack on an enterprise. And despite the millions of dollars that we've invested in authentication, MFA, digital identity, and proofing, and cybersecurity controls, one surprising stat is that MFA adoption has actually stagnated. It's been flat since 2015. And we'll talk a little bit about why, but let's think about how we got here, okay? We don't want to be alarmists. We don't want to say the world is ending. We want to say it's going to get better, but how did we get here? How's it going to get better? If you look at the history of authentication, you'll see that it's really evolved over the last 60 years. We've got hardware tokens, soft token MFA. We've had great new ways of authenticating, but we still have passwords. And the way they were used in 1961 is pretty much the way they are used today. They haven't fundamentally changed. It's like we've built on top of the password for years and years but we still have passwords. And we've never really stopped to think, how do we get rid of them? Should we get rid of them? And although there have been attempts, let's be real now, they're still the dominant factor of authentication today. We got hard tokens. Hardware tokens were a huge step forward. Say what you will about them. Maybe they're high friction. Maybe they're difficult to adopt. Maybe they actually see very niche or low adoption. And maybe there are headaches around sharing them and losing them, but they did a good job in making authentication more secure. I know we've all used one at some point in our career. And maybe some of us have even encountered smart cards. Smart cards were a very interesting step forward because I think they popularized PKI. You really started to see, broad use of these in both federal and even in the private sector. Physical access, transaction signatures. We've seen smart cards all over the place, but they've had some pretty niche adoption, right? You're not going to see your family members walking around authenticating with smart cards all the time. Not really. But you will see them using SMS 2FA. So the smartphone really brought MFA to the masses. You started seeing SMS two-factor become very popular over the past decade. It's very much a regular part of the banking experience at this point, or the online experience, if you will. And over the past couple of years, we've seen a pretty big shift away from SMS 2FA. When NIST deprecated it and said we should really just start moving away from it back in 2016, and as recently as the large-scale attacks that we've seen over the past year, very publicized attacks. Like German banks are basically talking about legislation to axe the SMS 2FA and OTP as a viable method. So this is something that I think shifted very quickly from very popular to very unpopular. And we started to see adoption of phone as a token MFA, or software-based MFA, app-based MFA, push-based MFA. You know these apps. We love these apps. We use them. Some of us have multiple apps on our phone. Some of us have authenticator apps for our personal, our work accounts. I know a guy who has a dozen of these on their phone, unironically. Like, he really needs all of them. And this is pretty interesting because they've gone much further than hardware-based tokens. But if you look at the adoption over the past few years, they've really kind of hit a brick wall, right? We've seen adoption stagnate. If you look at the Internet Trends Report from 2019, this is kind of like the VC almanac, right? Like the big VCs in the Valley love reading this thing. Where is the industry going? Where are internet applications headed? What should we invest in? And I like to read it for the cyber trends, right? You notice little nuggets in there. And this one really stood out to me. Adoption of MFA has kind of flatlined over the past couple of years, despite all the hype and all the many millions of dollars being invested into it. And one of the reasons is user experience. So when you talk with users about these apps, you'll notice that the combination of password plus MFA is very slow. It's annoying to the end user. I know that as people in this industry, we sometimes walk around in a reality distortion field, right? We don't really think how good or bad is a user experience. We only think how secure is it. But what we're seeing is that the users are basically telling us, hey, we're not going to use this if it's going to make our lives slower and more difficult. So I think that's why you're seeing big gaps around customer MFA. Companies have been really slow to adopt it for e-commerce and even banking because they don't want to slow down the customer experience. Desktop MFA is a huge gap. I mean, how many of you on this call logged into your workstation today with a password? Even those of you with Windows Hello probably still use passwords in many situations. So these are gaps that we've seen across the board. So obviously the world is on fire. No, not really, but authentication is certainly not the utopia we were promised. Customer and desktop MFA, as I mentioned, has really been a big gap. Everybody's still using passwords. Let's be real now. We can talk passwordless all we want. Every person on this call used a password multiple times today. And when you look at the tools that we have, even a 12-year-old can launch a really large-scale attack. It's at a point where we have to do something. We have to completely change our way of thinking. We have to evolve. So where is authentication going? Well, one thing that you'll notice is that cyber really hasn't experienced its transformational moment. When you look at InfoSec, it's hard to point to a transformational moment like you would in these other industries. You know, the mobile, the rise of the smartphone really changed everything for the consumer experience. I mean, completely evolved. The rise of Agile reimagined the way we develop software, the way we engineer, the way we work. And cloud really revolutionized IT and applications and the workforce and everything that you 20 years ago thought was not possible. And the speed of delivery and usability that we once only imagined is now possible through these types of transformations. So where is it for cybersecurity? Well, we believe that passwordless is that transformation. It is the thing that many of us and the hard workers in this industry have been looking for and waiting for. And it's gone so far as Microsoft and Google really calling this the true passwordless era. I mean, this is a term that Hyper came up with years ago, and to see Google recognize it a year ago on their site was just fantastic. It really validated that this is it. Now's the time. We're entering that true passwordless decade. And many people now are understanding the problem. So what is it? What is the problem? How can we bucket the problem in a very digestible way? When you look at legacy MFA, you see some pretty noticeable issues with it. First of all, it relies heavily on shared secrets, passwords, PINs, OTP, or really one-time passwords, still a password, it's in the name. These are shared secrets stored inside the enterprise. And when you do this type of model, you create a very expensive to defend target that is very easy to attack. So the bad guys are really trying to break into many user accounts at the same time. They're not really trying to crack this target directly. They've started to weaponize many reused passwords against this target. So taking large-scale credential stuffing attacks, password spraying, brute forcing, mobile password malware. All of these attempts at replaying passwords and shared secrets are a way of bad guys attacking millions of users at the same time. And because we have these gaps in MFA, and because we have this reliance on passwords and shared secrets, we've really created an environment that's expensive to defend and difficult to use. We've seen incremental improvements, but we still have that root problem. So the solution in this era, this passwordless era, is what we like to call true passwordless MFA, or true passwordless authentication. And what that means by that is moving away from shared secrets entirely, moving the keys to the user's phone, get rid of the shared secret, enable users to authenticate in a true passwordless way using their smartphone as if it were a smart card or a hardware token. And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment, but really what you want to think about here is an environment where the attacker has to attack each user individually. The credential stuffing and the replay attacks become very difficult. It becomes almost too expensive to attack. And simultaneously, it becomes easy to use for the user. So this allows us to solve that MFA gap at the desktop, at the customer login portal, all of these places that people did not want to use legacy MFA. So the simple way of thinking about it is true passwordless takes you from a target that's expensive to defend and easy to attack to an environment that's expensive to attack but easy to defend. And this is every security practitioner's desire. It's what they've been wanting for quite some time. So how do I explain true passwordless MFA to my bosses, to my boardroom, to my users? It's kind of like turning your smartphone into a smart card. We mentioned smart cards earlier. People were fans of smart cards, are fans of smart cards. We're combining the security of a smart card with the convenience of a smartphone. And we're doing this by combining open standards, public key encryption, mobile initiated authentication, and really merging together the things that make user experience fast and easy with the cutting edge leading standards that are developed by companies like Microsoft, Google, to enable passwordless authentication. So not to get too technical here, we're happy to answer questions about how PKI or FIDO authentication works, but really this is a model that's very familiar to the security practitioner. We're storing private keys on users' personal devices. Those private keys are never shared or stored centrally. The attacker would really have to focus on each device individually, and that completely changes the type of attack that we can see and we can expect. So that's a evolution. It's a step forward in authentication, and what you're seeing is a lot of adoption. So, you know, if you listen to Gartner, and we all love Gartner, we all read Gartner studies and reports, we all take it seriously. You know, by 2022, a majority of large companies is going to use passwordless in more than half of their use cases. I mean, that's a pretty tall figure. And, you know, if you're not in this industry, it's kind of difficult to see that adoption. We're seeing it from big companies, small businesses, medium and large enterprises across the globe, financial services, e-commerce, mobile operators, you name it. So some of the use cases for passwordless, we're starting to see very focused passwordless initiatives. We see them for both internal and external use cases. Passwordless customer authentication is a big one. You have companies like Aetna and CVS Health who have deployed a passwordless to their customer applications across mobile and web. And they're seeing a drastic decrease in fraud. I mean, we had a recent webcast where they demonstrated a 99% decrease in mobile account takeover fraud. I mean, that is a figure that is almost unheard of in this industry. I mean, if you needed one factor to point at for the value of passwordless or the impact of passwordless, that would be it. Not to mention the user experience impact, right? You're making it faster and easier for people to log in. They no longer have to remember their password. I mean, this is just making the users happier. It's making them feel safer. And not just for the customers, it's the workforce too. I mean, you're talking about addressing a big gap in the enterprise. The desktop, the front door, the thing that has never really had great multi-factor authentication. And the thing that has even become more relevant in these past few weeks and months is the remote workforce. I mean, as you look at you know, trends just in the past 3 months, RDP attacks have never been higher. I mean, the number of RDP attacks we're seeing is it's at a level and scale like never before, and something needs to be done to significantly improve this. In fact, from where we're sitting, we've been seeing a lot of requests for passwordless RDP, passwordless remote login, and a renewed interest from the admin to really bring passwordless into that mix. It's especially important for remote workers logging into their VPNs, remote work for single sign-on. You know, VPN usage has spiked significantly in the past couple of months. And what's interesting is the VPN, you know, typically where you used to occasionally use it as a remote worker, or you'd have some expected amount of people logging in to the VPN, has drastically changed. I mean, you have your entire workforce beating it up constantly, being asked to re-authenticate, forgetting their passwords, getting locked out. I mean, there are some pretty interesting support tickets that our customers have been telling us about with regards to VPN, MFA, and passwords. And that's where passwordless VPN has really been making an impact. So before we wrap up, I'd love to give a quick, you know, just a video demo of what that looks like. And it's probably going to lag on this call, but I'll play it for you anyway and just talk through, like, what does it look like for a remote worker to use passwordless? So whether it's an RDP connection or you know, logging into your VPN, what you'll see here is smartphone and the workstation working together to enable desktop MFA, passwordless VPN, and RDP. And as a user, I can use True Passwordless MFA to log into my workstation. So in this scenario, I am selecting my workstation on my mobile device. You see the Hyper app there. as I select my workstation, I'm prompted to authenticate, and I'm logged in. Kind of like a smart card, right? Now, if I want to use my VPN, I'm going to experience something similar. You see a password field, but you don't see me entering a password. I'm able to use true passwordless MFA to log in. I just did 2 passwordless logins, and I'm going in with the RDP connection. So again, passwordless MFA. I don't even know what my password is. What's fantastic about this is I just did 3 logins in under 15 seconds in a way that was once not even thought to be possible. So combining that security and productivity allows us to bring the remote workforce an experience that they haven't had before, and bring the admins a level of security and peace of mind that was never thought possible, even 2 decades ago. So, hopefully that gives you a good idea of what this looks like in practice. We often tell people, we're going to give you a 30-second demo, and then it's going to take 30 minutes to explain what and why is happening. So with that said, we invite anybody who wants to accelerate their passwordless journey to try passwordless MFA. Work with Turnkey, work with Hyper, get a free trial going, accelerate your passwordless journey, and let's make this the passwordless decade. Thank you all.
Okay, so thanks very much, George. I think everyone will agree that that was a great insight into the journey through the world of passwordless authentication. It's crazy that every second login to a bank is malicious. That's just outrageous. But yeah, thanks for showing us how to rid ourselves of that, of the threat that passwords pose. The use case that you give us about CBS Health reducing, account hijacking by 99% is just amazing. And I think another point that you raised there as well around the VPN uptake, especially in the kind of the climate of COVID. But MFA hasn't risen. What that really shows is that enterprises are basically prioritizing the user experience over security. Because otherwise they would introduce MFA with the VPNs as well. So I think that demonstrating that you can actually improve the user experience while providing a more secure service through using Hyper and using passwordless technology. But yeah, we now have a few minutes to answer some of your questions. We do have lots of questions, and we only have a limited amount of time. So any we don't get to today, we'll take offline and get back to you in due course. So let me just get a few of these on screen, and I'll pass them over to you, George. So the first question we have here, really, really good question. How long does it usually take to implement passwordless technology into an environment? Can you integrate with existing technologies? And can you stage the rollouts to different sets of users at a time, so it's not like a big bang deployment?
That's a great question. That's a 3-parter. So I'll take that one part at a time. So on deployment time, and I think that's related to the staged rollout. So we see customers doing things in one of a few different ways. So let's start with consumer authentication. It should take only a day or 2 to integrate our SDKs into these mobile and web applications. So I think that the actual integration component is very quick and easy. It's well documented. We've had customers deploy multiple applications with Hyper within days and be very satisfied with that outcome. The actual adoption is where you start seeing the curve, right? You have to get people to update their apps. Many people don't auto-update. And you have to actually get them to enroll. So what we've seen is folks in the financial services industry have seen numbers like 4 to 5 million user enrollments within 2 to 3 quarters, for example, which I think are very healthy figures. To see users enroll into passwordless, which is essentially opt-in, right? You don't want to force it on them. You want to give them a choice. So you'll see them prompted to enroll in passwordless with a message that says something like, hey, you've updated your app, we've updated our login experience, do you want to go passwordless? And to see that level of opt-in over just a half year in the millions, I think is a very, very good figure. We've also seen others who do a staggered rollout. For example, for the workforce. The workforce use case will typically begin with an internal user pilot. You may see a department like an IT team or an InfoSec department begin the passwordless transformation or the passwordless initiative. And that's oftentimes where it starts, right? We don't give enough credit to the IT admins and InfoSec engineers at these companies. They do some of the best innovating, I think, and they bring some of the best technologies to the table. And that's typically where these initiatives start. They get championed and piloted, and then they start to make their way out through the workforce. And oftentimes we'll see a staged rollout by use case. So for example, desktop MFA is the front door. That's where you start. Then you'll see single sign-on go online. So passwordless with single sign-on. And the users will be communicated that we're doing a phased rollout. They'll very easily understand and enroll into these services because it's very much intuitive. You know, you're logging in with the password one day, and then you're logging in with the phone the next day. And now you're asked to do that for your SSO and your VPN and all these other use cases. And over time, you know, the full workforce should become passwordless. We've seen other companies in the industry who try to do kind of a spray and pray approach, which is do all use cases, all users, all geographies, and all demographics at once and see what the adoption is. And we find that, or at least we hear from customers, that that's not necessarily the best way to introduce passwordless. Because remember, this is a fundamentally different user experience. I mean, the user is going from something they do every day, like typing in a password, to something that, you know, is new. It's using their phone to log in. So I think it's important to do a phased rollout.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, in this, you know, in the kind of day and age now, people are just kind of used to using MFA, so on their banks, all of those types of, you know, financial institutions now, you know, they force you to use that type of multi-factor authentication. So I think, you know, the uptake and adoption should be slightly easier than it may have been sort of five years ago. But yeah, cheers, George. So going into another question. So we have one here. We get MFA free with our Office 365 licenses. What additional benefits would Hyper bring to us?
Do you mind if I do a quick screen share just for this question?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So your question was about free MFA. You receive free MFA, Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator. There are an endless number of free MFA apps out there. And you know why they're free? They're not doing anything new. If you're paying for MFA in 2020, that is something interesting because there's so much of it that's free and readily available, right? What you should be doing is doing something better than the existing MFA, right? If you're getting free MFA and that's good enough, then that's great. But you're still experiencing what many of our customers are experiencing, which is this thing that you see on screen here, a completely fragmented experience that relies on passwords and shared secrets. That free MFA that you're describing is built on top of passwords. It's not passwordless. It's not attempting to eliminate the password. It is the same thing we've been using for years. And if that's good enough for you and that meets the compliance requirements, then by all means, there's no need to change. But it won't solve your password problem. It doesn't solve your password problem, and that's not what it's designed to do. So what we have is many customers who come to us and say, Hyper, we have a lot of these free MFA apps on our phone. Our users have to remember to use 4 different apps. Some of these apps we're paying for. And the question they should be asking is, to the paid MFA providers, why are we paying for this if we get it for free from another provider, right? So I think that's an interesting question that I think Hyper can kind of step away from. Our vision and our solution is not to make your MFA better or less expensive. It's to take you true passwordless, which looks like this. It's unifying your login experiences with one true passwordless authentication. Keeping your identity providers the way they are. You like your identity provider? You love it? Great. We're not an identity provider. We don't want to touch the identity layer. In fact, the passwordless solution should not require you to change or modify your identity provider. That is not what passwordless should be about. It should be about removing the password from the equation, irrespective of what you're logging into, whether it's your VPN, your workstation, your desktop, your IDP. This is not something that a free MFA app does. A free MFA app is just like any other MFA app. It's just free. So if your goal is to go passwordless, this is the right approach. This is the recommended approach. If your goal is to just stick with the legacy MFA that you already have, by all means, you should use a free MFA app. There's no need to pay for it at this point. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great, George. Thank you. So another question here. I think you've touched on both of these, but it's a good question. Is Hyper just for our employees, or can we use this for our customers too?
So I think that was answered a little bit earlier in the call, but yes, Passwordless is something we believe should be deployed to both consumers and the workforce. It really depends on your initiative. Hyper comes in two forms: one for your consumer, which is our true passwordless SDK that gets plugged into your applications. So if you have mobile and web applications, you plug in Hyper, and now you've gone true passwordless. And Hyper for your workforce, which enables true passwordless desktop MFA and true passwordless SSO and remote login. And that's happening through the Hyper app. So as you have deployed previously authentication apps to your workforce, in this case, you're deploying the Hyper app, and it's branded for your company. It's really fast and easy to use, but it essentially achieves the same outcome. You're going passwordless, it's just a different use case.
Perfect. Thank you, George. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our allotted time, and we do have some further questions from you all, so thank you for those. Apologies that we didn't get to them all. However, we will take them offline and respond to them individually. I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and also George for an excellent session. And just a reminder to everybody that the further sessions available online, and they will be available on demand to rewatch at your leisure, available on the website. But if you do have any questions, please do feel free to contact me directly with the details on screen now. We hope you enjoyed this session and the rest of the conference. Thanks again for joining us today. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day.